The whispers started the moment Victoria Lawson stepped into Henderson's general store on a sweltering July morning in 1882. Her worn boots echoing against the wooden floorboards, as three women near the fabric counter suddenly went silent and turned to stare. Victoria pretended not to notice, keeping her chin high as she moved toward the counter where Mr. Henderson stood sorting through a delivery of tinned goods. She could feel their eyes traveling over her full figure, taking in the way her simple calico dress strained slightly across her hips and bosom, the way her round face showed perspiration from the walk into town under the merciless Nebraska sun. "Miss Lawson," Mr. Henderson greeted her with a polite nod, though his gaze flickered nervously toward the women behind her. "What can I do for you today?" "I need flour, sugar, and salt," Victoria said clearly, refusing to lower her voice or show any shame. "And if you have any good thread, I could use that as well." As Mr. Henderson gathered her supplies, Victoria heard the whispers begin again, louder now, meant to be heard. "26 years old and still unmarried," one of them said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "Such a shame. Though I suppose it is not surprising given her size. Men want wives who are delicate, not women who look like they could wrestle a steer." Another voice chimed in. "My Harold says she eats enough for 3 men. No wonder she is built like that. What man would want to feed such an appetite?" Victoria's hands clenched into fists at her sides, but she kept her face carefully neutral. She had heard worse over the years, much worse. Growing up in Scottsbluff, Nebraska, she had always been larger than the other girls, taller and broader and heavier. While they had grown into willowy young women who attracted suitors like bees to honey, Victoria had remained solid and strong, with curves that the town deemed unfashionable and undesirable. "That will be $2.40, Mr. Henderson said quietly, and Victoria detected something like pity in his eyes, which somehow stung worse than the cruel words. She counted out the coins with steady hands, gathered her supplies, and turned to leave. As she passed the 3 women, one of them actually stepped back, as if Victoria's mere presence might contaminate her. Victoria walked out into the bright sunshine, her eyes burning but refusing to shed tears. She had cried enough tears over the years to fill the North Platte River that ran through town. She would not waste any more on people who could not see past her exterior to the person she was inside. The walk back to her small homestead on the outskirts of Scottsbluff took nearly an hour, and by the time Victoria arrived, her dress was soaked with sweat, and her arms ached from carrying the heavy supplies. The little house her father had built before he died 5 years ago sat weathered but sturdy on the prairie, surrounded by the vegetable garden Victoria tended with her own hands. She had 30 acres that she worked herself, growing enough to survive and occasionally sell at market. It was a hard life, a lonely life, but it was hers. Victoria set her supplies on the kitchen table and walked to the window, looking out at the endless expanse of golden grassland that stretched toward the horizon. Sometimes she wondered what her life might have been like if she had been born different, smaller, prettier in the way society deemed acceptable. Would she have married young like the other girls? Would she have a house full of children by now, a husband who came home each evening to kiss her cheek? But then she shook her head, dismissing such thoughts. She was who she was, and no amount of wishing would change that. Victoria Lawson was strong, capable, and independent. If the world could not appreciate those qualities, that was the world's loss, not hers. The next morning, Victoria woke before dawn to work in her garden. The tomatoes needed picking, and several rows of beans were ready for harvest. She was on her knees in the dirt, her hands stained with earth and her hair falling loose from its bun, when she heard the sound of hoofbeats approaching. Victoria stood. shading her eyes against the rising sun, and saw a rider coming toward her property. As the horse drew closer, Victoria could make out the figure of a man, tall in the saddle, wearing a dusty brown hat and a dark vest over a work shirt. He rode with the easy confidence of someone who had spent most of his life on horseback, and when he was close enough for Victoria to see his face, she was struck by the rugged handsomeness of his features. He had a strong jaw shadowed with several days' worth of dark stubble, intense blue eyes that seemed to take in everything at once, and sun-bronzed skin that spoke of long hours working outdoors. The man pulled his horse to a stop near Victoria's fence and touched the brim of his hat in greeting. "Morning, madam," he said, his voice a deep baritone that seemed to resonate in Victoria's chest. "I am looking for the Lawson place. Would that be here?" "It would," Victoria replied, wiping her dirty hands on her apron. "I am Victoria Lawson. What can I do for you?" The man dismounted with fluid grace and walked closer to the fence, leading his horse behind him. Now that he was standing, Victoria could see he was well over 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders and the lean, muscular build of a working cowboy. "Name is Thomas Parker," he said, extending a hand over the fence. "I have been working at the Triple Bar Ranch about 10 miles north of here, but I am looking to settle down, maybe start my own small operation. I heard in town that you might have some land you would be willing to lease or sell." Victoria shook his hand, noting the calluses on his palm and the strength in his grip. "I have not told anyone I was looking to sell," she said carefully. "Where did you hear that?" Thomas's expression darkened slightly. "At the saloon last night. A few men were talking about you, saying that a woman had no business trying to work a homestead alone, that you would probably be grateful if someone offered to take it off your hands." He paused, his blue eyes meeting hers directly. "They said some other things too, things that were not fit to repeat. I told them they should keep their opinions to themselves." Victoria felt heat rise to her cheeks, though whether from embarrassment or anger she could not say. "I appreciate you defending me, Mr. Parker, but I am quite used to people talking about me. As for my land, it is not for sale. I work it myself, and I intend to continue doing so." She expected him to argue, to try to convince her that a woman could not possibly manage such work alone, but instead Thomas simply nodded. "That is understandable. I apologize for bothering you, Miss Lawson." He started to turn back toward his horse, then paused. "If you do not mind my saying so, you have got a fine operation here. Those tomatoes look excellent, and your beans are some of the healthiest I have seen. You clearly know what you are doing." The compliment caught Victoria completely off guard. When was the last time anyone had praised her work, her skills, her accomplishments? "Thank you," she managed to say. "I do my best." Thomas mounted his horse and touched his hat brim again. "I hope you have a good day, Miss Lawson. And if you ever need a hand with anything, I will be at the Triple Bar for the foreseeable future. Jim Patterson is the owner. He can tell you I am trustworthy." Victoria watched him ride away, her heart beating strangely fast in her chest. There had been something different about Thomas Parker, something in the way he looked at her. He had not stared at her body with disgust or pity. He had not treated her like she was less than human because of her size. He had simply spoken to her like an equal, one rancher to another, and that small kindness meant more than he could possibly know. Over the next few weeks, Victoria found herself thinking about Thomas Parker more often than she wanted to admit. She told herself she was being foolish, that a man like him probably had women falling at his feet wherever he went. He had likely already forgotten their brief conversation. But then, on a Saturday afternoon when Victoria was in town selling vegetables at the market, she saw him again. Thomas was coming out of the blacksmith shop, carrying what looked like newly repaired tack. When he spotted Victoria at her market stall, his serious face broke into a genuine smile, and he changed direction to walk toward her. "Miss Lawson," he said warmly, "how have you been?" "Well, thank you," Victoria replied, trying to ignore the way her pulse quickened at his approach. "And yourself?" "Cannot complain. Working hard, saving money." He looked at her display of vegetables, beans, tomatoes, squash, and corn. "These look wonderful. How much for some of those tomatoes?" 20 cents a pound, Victoria said, the same price she charged everyone else. Thomas pulled out his coin purse and selected several coins. "I will take 5 pounds if you have that many." As Victoria carefully selected and weighed the tomatoes, wrapping them in brown paper, she was acutely aware of Thomas standing close by, watching her work with those intense blue eyes. "You must really like tomatoes," she said, attempting lightness. "I do," Thomas agreed. "But mostly I like supporting good farmers. You grow the best produce in Scottsbluff, Miss Lawson. Everyone at the ranch says so." Victoria's hands stilled for a moment. "Everyone at the ranch knows about my vegetables. I have been telling them," Thomas admitted. "Jim Patterson actually asked me to buy extra for the ranch hands if you have it available. They are tired of the tough, tasteless food we usually get." And so, unexpectedly, Victoria gained a significant new customer. Each Saturday for the next month, Thomas came to the market and bought substantial quantities of whatever Victoria had available. He always stayed to talk for a few minutes, asking about her crops and telling her stories about life on the Triple Bar Ranch. Victoria found herself looking forward to these encounters, treasuring the easy conversation and the way Thomas seemed genuinely interested in what she had to say. But the other townspeople noticed too, and the whispers grew louder. One Saturday, as Thomas walked away from Victoria's stall carrying a crate of vegetables, Victoria heard Mrs. Henderson say to her companion, "That poor man is too polite to tell her he is not interested. Can you imagine? She probably thinks a handsome cowboy like that would actually court someone like her." The words hit Victoria like a physical blow. She had been foolish to let herself hope, even a little, that Thomas's kindness meant anything more than Christian charity. Of course he was not interested in her romantically. No man ever had been, and no man ever would be. That evening, back at her homestead, Victoria threw herself into work, trying to exhaust herself enough that she would not lie awake thinking about Thomas Parker and his blue eyes and his warm smile. She was mucking out the small barn where she kept her 2 dairy cows and her mule when she heard a horse approaching. Assuming it was a neighbor, she set down her pitchfork and walked outside, only to find Thomas dismounting near her fence. "Mr. Parker," she said, surprised. "Did you forget something at the market?" "No," Thomas said, and there was something different in his voice, something tense. "Miss Lawson, I need to speak with you about something, and I hope you will hear me out." Victoria's stomach tightened with dread. Had he come to tell her that the ranch would no longer be buying her produce? Had he finally realized that being seen speaking with her was damaging his reputation? "Of course," she said quietly. "Would you like to come inside? I can make coffee." "That would be appreciated." Victoria led Thomas into her small house, acutely aware of how humble it must seem. The main room served as both kitchen and sitting area, with a fireplace at one end and her narrow bed tucked in a corner behind a curtain. Everything was clean and tidy, but there was no disguising the poverty of her circumstances. She put coffee on to boil and gestured for Thomas to sit at the small table. Thomas removed his hat and sat down, turning the hat brim in his hands, clearly gathering his thoughts. "Miss Lawson," he began, "I heard what some of the women said at the market today. I want you to know that they are wrong. About me, about you, about everything." Victoria busied herself with the coffee, not trusting herself to speak. "I have been coming to the market to see you," Thomas continued. "Yes, I buy your vegetables because they are excellent, but that is not the real reason. The truth is, I look forward to our conversations all week long. You are intelligent, hardworking, and genuinely kind. I admire you, Miss Lawson. I admire you more than I have admired anyone in a very long time." Victoria's hands were shaking as she poured the coffee. "Mr. Parker, you do not need to say things like that out of pity. I know what I am. I know how people see me." "Do you?" Thomas stood and walked to where Victoria stood by the stove. He was so tall that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes, and what she saw there took her breath away. There was no pity, no disgust, no polite tolerance. There was warmth and interest, and something that looked almost like longing. "I see a woman who works harder than most men I know," Thomas said softly. "I see someone who has faced cruelty and judgment but has not let it make her cruel in return. I see strength and capability and beauty." "Beauty," Victoria's voice came out as barely a whisper. "Mr. Parker, I think you need spectacles." "My vision is perfect," Thomas replied, "and I know my own mind." "Miss Lawson, Victoria, I have been trying to work up the courage to ask you this for weeks now. Would you allow me to court you? Properly, I mean. With the intention of marriage, if you find that you could care for me." Victoria stared at him, unable to believe what she was hearing. "This is a joke," she said, taking a step back. "Someone put you up to this. Was it the men from the saloon? They probably thought it would be hilarious to have you pretend to be interested in the fat spinster and then—" "Stop," Thomas said firmly. He caught her hand, his calloused fingers warm around hers. "This is not a joke, and no one put me up to anything. I am asking you because I want to. Because I have not been able to stop thinking about you since the morning I rode up to your homestead and saw you working in your garden, strong and capable and beautiful in the sunlight." "I am not beautiful," Victoria insisted, but tears were starting to stream down her cheeks. "I am too heavy. I am too plain. I am everything a woman is not supposed to be." "You are everything I want," Thomas said, and the conviction in his voice made something crack open in Victoria's chest. "I do not want a delicate flower who will wilt at the first sign of hardship. I want a strong woman like you, Victoria. A woman who can face life head-on, who knows the value of hard work, who will not give up when things get difficult. That is what I want. That is what I need. That is you." Victoria searched his face for any sign of deception or mockery, but found only sincerity. "You truly mean this?" she said wonderingly. "I truly mean this," Thomas confirmed. "I know I am not much of a catch myself. I am just a cowboy with more ambition than money, and I cannot promise you an easy life. But I can promise that I will work hard for us, that I will treat you with respect and kindness, and that I will never, ever be ashamed of you." The tears were coming faster now, and Victoria did not try to stop them. For 26 years, she had believed that she was unlovable, that her body made her unworthy of affection or desire. And now here was this man, this strong, handsome, capable man, telling her that he wanted her exactly as she was. "Yes," Victoria said through her tears. "Yes, Thomas, you can court me." Thomas's face lit up with a joy so pure and unguarded that it took Victoria's breath away. He lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "You have made me very happy, Victoria. I promise you will not regret this." But Victoria soon discovered that accepting Thomas's courtship was easier than dealing with the town's reaction to it. When Thomas began openly escorting Victoria to church on Sundays, sitting beside her in the pew and holding her hand for all to see, the whispers turned to open speculation and scorn. "He must be after her land," Mrs. Henderson pronounced loudly enough for half the congregation to hear. What other reason could there possibly be? Perhaps he lost a bet, another woman suggested with a cruel laugh. Or maybe his eyesight is failing and he cannot tell what she looks like. Thomas heard these comments too, and Victoria watched his jaw tighten with anger, but he never responded. Instead, he simply held Victoria's hand tighter and made sure everyone saw him smile at her with genuine affection. The men were even worse. At the saloon one evening, Thomas was confronted by a group of ranch hands who had been drinking heavily. "Parker, we cannot figure it out," one of them said, swaying on his feet. "Is this some kind of long game? Are you trying to get her land? Because if you are just planning to marry her and then run off, that is low even for a drifter like you." "I am not after her land," Thomas said evenly, though his hands had curled into fists at his sides. "I am courting Victoria because I care about her, because she is an exceptional woman." The men burst into laughter. "Exceptional? She is fat as a Christmas goose." "You could do so much better, Parker. Hell, Jenny at the saloon has been making eyes at you for weeks, and she is actually pretty." Thomas stood, his chair scraping loudly against the wooden floor. "You will not speak about Victoria that way," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Not in my hearing. Not ever. You understand?" The largest of the men stood as well, puffing out his chest. "Or what? You are going to fight all of us over some fat girl who should be grateful any man looks at her twice." What happened next was something of a blur. Thomas's fist connected with the man's jaw with a sickening crack. And then suddenly, everyone was fighting, chairs and tables overturning in the chaos. By the time the sheriff arrived to break it up, Thomas had a split lip and a bruised eye, but he had given as good as he got. The sheriff, a weary man named John Curtis, made everyone settle their tabs and then escorted Thomas outside. "Parker, I respect that you were defending Miss Lawson's honor," he said quietly, "but you need to understand something. This town has decided what they think about her, and nothing you do is going to change that. You are just going to make life harder for both of you." "I do not care what this town thinks," Thomas replied, wiping blood from his lip. "I care what Victoria thinks. I care that she knows someone values her." Sheriff Curtis studied Thomas for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "You really do care for her, don't you?" "I do, more than I have ever cared for anyone." "Then you are a better man than most, Parker. I wish you both luck. You are going to need it." When Thomas showed up at Victoria's homestead the next morning with a black eye and split lip, Victoria was horrified. "What happened to you?" she demanded, pulling him inside and making him sit while she fetched clean water and cloth. Thomas told her everything, including the vile things the men had said. Victoria's hands trembled as she cleaned his wounds. "You should not have fought them," she said quietly. "You should not risk yourself for me. Victoria, look at me." Thomas caught her hands, stilling them. "I will always stand up for you. Always. Because you deserve to be defended. You deserve to be cherished. And anyone who cannot see how remarkable you are is a fool." Victoria sank into the chair beside him, overwhelmed by the intensity of her feelings. She had tried to guard her heart, to not let herself fall too deeply too quickly, but it was too late. She was already in love with Thomas Parker, this brave, stubborn man who refused to let the world dictate who he should care about. "I am afraid," Victoria admitted. "I am afraid that one day you will wake up and realize they are right, that you could have done better, that you settled for me because I was convenient or available or willing." Thomas cupped her face in his hands, his blue eyes fierce. "Listen to me, Victoria Lawson. You are not convenient. You are not second best. You are not something I settled for. You are everything I have been looking for my entire life, and I was beginning to think I would never find you. Do you understand? I am not with you despite anything. I am with you because of everything you are. How can you be so sure?" Victoria whispered, Because when I think about my future, you are in every part of it, Thomas said simply. When I imagine the ranch I want to build, I see you beside me. When I think about coming home at the end of a long day, I see your face. When I imagine growing old, I see us sitting on a porch together, watching our grandchildren play. It is always you, Victoria. It has been you from the moment I saw you standing in your garden with dirt on your hands and determination in your eyes. Victoria kissed him then, her first real kiss, pressing her lips to his despite the split that must have made it painful. Thomas kissed her back gently, his hands tangling in her hair, and Victoria felt something settle deep in her soul. This was real. This was true. This man loved her. Over the following months, Thomas's courtship became the talk of Scottsbluff. Some people thought it was scandalous. Others thought it was pathetic. But a few, a small but growing number, began to see what Thomas saw. They noticed how Victoria smiled now, how she held her head higher, how she moved through the world with new confidence. They noticed how hard Thomas worked, saving every penny, making plans for their future. And slowly, grudgingly, a few of them began to admit that perhaps there was more to Victoria Lawson than they had realized. One person who came around was Jim Patterson, the owner of the Triple Bar Ranch. He had watched Thomas's courtship with initial skepticism, but as the weeks passed, he could not deny that his best cowboy had never been happier or more motivated. One day, Jim pulled Thomas aside and made him an offer. "Parker, you have been talking about starting your own spread," Jim said. "What if I helped you do that? I have got 40 acres on the south edge of my property that I have not been using. It has good water, decent grazing. I will sell it to you at a fair price and you can pay me back over time. You could start building while you keep working for me." Thomas was stunned. "Mr. Patterson, I do not know what to say. That is incredibly generous. You are a good worker and a good man, Thomas, and Miss Lawson is a good woman, no matter what the bid is in town say. You two deserve a chance to build something together." Jim extended his hand. "What do you say?" Thomas shook his hand firmly. "I say thank you, sir. You will not regret this." That evening, Thomas rode straight to Victoria's homestead, barely able to contain his excitement. Victoria was in the kitchen preparing supper when he burst through the door, picked her up, and spun her around despite her startled yelp. "Thomas, what in the world? Jim Patterson is selling me 40 acres, Thomas said, setting her down but keeping his arms around her waist. "Good land, Victoria. Land where we can build a house, raise cattle, make a real life together." Victoria's eyes went wide. "Thomas, that is wonderful, but can you afford it?" "He is letting me pay over time and I have been saving. It will be tight at first, but we can do it. We can do anything together." Thomas took a deep breath, then dropped to one knee right there in her kitchen. "Victoria Lawson, I know we have only been courting for a few months, but I have never been more certain of anything in my life. I love you. I love your strength, your kindness, your determination. I love the way you face each day with courage even when the world is cruel. I love everything about you, and I want to spend the rest of my life showing you how much. Will you marry me?" Victoria looked down at this remarkable man kneeling before her, this cowboy who had seen past everything society said she should be and loved her for who she was. "Yes," she said, tears streaming down her face. "Yes, Thomas, I will marry you. I love you so much." Thomas stood and kissed her deeply, properly, the kind of kiss that spoke of passion and promise and a future full of possibility. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Thomas rested his forehead against hers. "I want to marry you as soon as possible," he said. "I do not want to wait." "Is that all right?" "That is more than all right," Victoria agreed. "I have waited long enough for happiness. I am ready to start our life together." They set the wedding for 3 weeks away, which barely gave Victoria enough time to sew herself a proper dress. She worked on it every evening after her chores were done, her fingers flying over the pale blue fabric she had chosen. Blue for new beginnings, blue like Thomas's eyes, blue like the endless Nebraska sky that stretched above their land. The night before the wedding, Victoria's closest neighbor, an elderly widow named Mrs. Cooper who had always been kind to her, came by with a gift. "I know the other women in town have not exactly been supportive," Mrs. Cooper said gently, handing Victoria a beautifully embroidered veil. "But I want you to know that some of us see what a good match you and Mr. Parker are. He is a fine man, and you deserve every happiness, dear." Victoria hugged the older woman, touched beyond words. "Thank you," she managed to say through tears. "Thank you for always being kind to me." "Kindness costs nothing," Mrs. Cooper replied. "I do not understand why more people have not figured that out. Now, let me see this dress you have been working on." The wedding took place at the small church in Scottsbluff on a crisp October morning in 1882. The leaves on the few trees in town had turned gold and red, and the air held the first hint of the winter to come. Victoria stood at the back of the church in her blue dress, her hands trembling as she held a simple bouquet of wildflowers that Thomas had picked for her that morning. The church was not full. Many of the townspeople had declined to attend, making it clear that they did not approve of the match, but the people who mattered were there. Mrs. Cooper sat in the front row, dabbing at her eyes. Jim Patterson and several of the ranch hands from the Triple Bar had come to support Thomas. Sheriff Curtis and his wife were there, and standing at the altar, looking more handsome than any man had a right to in his best suit, was Thomas. When Victoria began walking down the aisle and Thomas's face lit up with pure joy at the sight of her, Victoria realized something profound. She had spent so many years believing that her worth was determined by her appearance, by whether society found her acceptable. But Thomas had shown her a different truth. Her worth came from who she was inside, from her character and her heart and her soul. And in Thomas's eyes, she was not just acceptable. She was cherished. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt. When the minister asked Thomas if he took Victoria to be his wife, Thomas's voice rang out strong and clear. "I do, with all my heart." And when it was Victoria's turn, she looked into those blue eyes that had seen her, truly seen her from the very beginning, and said, "I do. Forever." "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the minister declared. "You may kiss your bride." Thomas did not hesitate. He pulled Victoria into his arms and kissed her thoroughly, not caring that they were in church, not caring who was watching. When he finally released her, he whispered in her ear, "You are the most beautiful bride who ever lived, Mrs. Parker." Mrs. Parker. Victoria was Mrs. Parker now, and the happiness that flooded through her at that realization was almost too much to bear. There was a small celebration afterward at the ranch, with food and music and dancing. Thomas danced with Victoria again and again, holding her close, making it clear to everyone that he was proud to have her as his wife. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Thomas whispered, "Are you ready to go home, Mrs. Parker?" Home. They had been working on their house for the past 2 weeks, a small but sturdy structure on the 40 acres Jim Patterson had sold them. It was not finished yet, but there was a roof and walls and a real bed, and it was theirs. Thomas drove them to their new home in a borrowed wagon, and when they arrived, he insisted on carrying Victoria over the threshold despite her protests that she was too heavy. "You are my wife," Thomas said firmly, "and I will carry my wife into our home properly." He carried her inside and set her gently on her feet in the middle of their main room. The house smelled of fresh pine and new beginnings. "It is not much yet," Thomas admitted, looking around at the bare walls and sparse furnishings. "But we will make it a home together, I promise you that." Victoria turned to her husband, her heart so full she thought it might burst. "It is already a home, Thomas, because you are here." That night, in the privacy of their new bedroom, Thomas made love to his wife with tenderness and passion, showing her with his body what he had been telling her with words all along. That she was desired, that she was beautiful, that every curve and line of her body was something to be treasured. Victoria had never felt so vulnerable and so safe at the same time, and when Thomas whispered that he loved her as they lay tangled together afterward, she knew she had finally found where she belonged. The first year of their marriage was not easy. Building a working ranch from almost nothing required backbreaking labor and long hours. Thomas continued working for Jim Patterson during the day while spending evenings and weekends building fences, a barn, and corrals on their own land. Victoria maintained her vegetable garden, which had expanded significantly now that she had Thomas to help prepare the soil, and she also took on the work of caring for the small herd of cattle they had purchased with their combined savings. There were times when money was so tight that they ate beans and cornbread for a week straight. There were times when Victoria wondered if they had taken on too much too soon. But through it all, Thomas never wavered in his love and support, and Victoria drew strength from knowing they were in this together. The townspeople's attitudes toward them remained mixed. Some people, impressed by Thomas and Victoria's obvious devotion to each other and their hard work, began to treat Victoria with more respect. Others continued to gossip and judge, unable to accept that a man like Thomas would genuinely want a woman like Victoria. One Sunday after church, about 8 months into their marriage, Victoria overheard a conversation that made her blood boil. She had stepped outside to wait for Thomas, who was discussing something with Jim Patterson, when she heard 2 women talking around the corner of the building. "Mark my words, he will leave her eventually," one of them said. "Men like him do not stay with women like her. He probably only married her for her land and her savings. Once he has what he needs, he will run off." "I almost feel sorry for her," the other woman replied. "She actually believes he loves her. Can you imagine being that deluded?" Victoria stepped around the corner, making both women jump. "Excuse me, ladies," she said, her voice shaking with barely controlled anger. "But if you are going to gossip about me, you could at least have the courtesy to do it when I am not within earshot." The women had the grace to look embarrassed, but the first one quickly recovered her composure. "We were simply expressing concern, Miss Law, I mean, Mrs. Parker. Surely you must know that people worry about you." "Worry about me," Victoria repeated incredulously. "You have never worried about me. You have spent years mocking me, shaming me, treating me like I was less than human because of my size. And now that I have found someone who actually values me, you cannot stand it. You cannot accept that maybe, just maybe, you were wrong about me. Now, see here," the second woman began, but Victoria cut her off. "No, you see here. I know what people say about me and Thomas. I know you all think he only married me for my land or my money or some other ulterior motive. But you are wrong. Thomas loves me. He loves me despite what the whole town thinks, despite the fact that being with me has made his life harder. He loves me because of who I am, not in spite of it. And if you cannot understand that, then I truly pity you, because you will never know what it is like to be loved that completely." Victoria turned and walked back into the church, her heart pounding. She had never stood up for herself like that before, never directly confronted the people who had been cruel to her. But being loved by Thomas had given her a new kind of courage. She no longer needed the town's approval to know her worth. Thomas found her a few minutes later, sitting in a back pew with tears streaming down her face. "Victoria, what happened?" He sat beside her and pulled her into his arms, and Victoria told him everything. When she finished, Thomas was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I am proud of you for standing up to them. But Victoria, I need you to know something. Their opinions do not matter. They never have. The only opinion that matters is mine, and I think you are the most incredible person I have ever met. Do you believe that?" "I do," Victoria said, and she realized she truly did. The doubts and insecurities were still there, but they were getting quieter, overshadowed by the certainty of Thomas's love. "Good," Thomas said, kissing her forehead, "because I have news that I think will make you happy. Jim Patterson has offered me a full partnership in the Triple Bar. He wants to expand the operation, and he thinks with my work and your business sense, yes, he specifically mentioned your business sense, we could make it very successful. It would mean guaranteed income while we continue building up our own herd. What do you think?" Victoria's mind was already racing with possibilities. "I think that is an incredible opportunity. Did you tell him yes?" "I told him I needed to discuss it with my wife first," Thomas said. "Because we are partners, Victoria, I do not make major decisions without you." This was so different from the marriages Victoria had observed growing up, where husbands made all the decisions and wives were expected to simply accept them. "Yes," she said firmly. "Tell him yes. We can do this, Thomas. We can build something amazing." And they did. Over the next 2 years, Thomas and Victoria worked harder than they had ever worked in their lives. The partnership with Jim Patterson proved incredibly successful, and their own herd grew steadily. Victoria's vegetable business expanded until she was supplying not just the Triple Bar but several other ranches in the area. She hired 2 local girls to help with the planting and harvesting, giving them fair wages and treating them with the respect she had so rarely received herself. Slowly but surely, the tide of public opinion began to turn. It was hard to maintain prejudice against someone who was successful, hardworking, and consistently kind to everyone she encountered. Victoria made a point of being gracious even to the people who had been cruelest to her, not because they deserved it, but because she refused to let their cruelty change who she was. One day, nearly 3 years after their wedding, Victoria realized that her monthly bleeding had not come. At first, she dismissed it as stress, but when another month passed with no sign of it, she allowed herself to hope. She said nothing to Thomas, not wanting to get his hopes up in case she was wrong, but when the 3rd month passed and she began to feel nauseated in the mornings, she knew. She was pregnant. Victoria had complicated feelings about this development. Part of her was overjoyed at the thought of having a child with Thomas, of building the family they had talked about. But another part of her was terrified. She had heard the other women in town talk about pregnancy and childbirth, how difficult it was, how dangerous it could be for women who were too heavy. What if something went wrong? What if she could not carry the baby to term? What if the baby was harmed because of her size? She finally told Thomas on a cool spring evening as they sat on their porch watching the sunset. "I am going to have a baby," she said quietly, her hand resting on her still flat stomach. Thomas went completely still for a moment, then turned to look at her with wonder in his eyes. "A baby." "Victoria, are you certain?" "As certain as I can be without seeing a doctor. I have missed 3 months now, and I have been sick in the mornings." Thomas let out a whoop of joy and pulled Victoria into his arms, spinning her around just like he had the day he proposed. "We are going to be parents." "Victoria, this is the best news I have ever heard." His joy was infectious, and Victoria found her fears melting away in the face of his excitement. "You are happy then?" "Happy. I am ecstatic." Thomas set her down and immediately dropped to his knees, pressing his face against her stomach. "Hello in there, little one. I am your father, and I already love you more than I knew was possible." Tears streamed down Victoria's face as she ran her fingers through Thomas's hair. This man, this wonderful man who had given her everything she had never dared to hope for, was going to be the father of her child. The pregnancy was not easy. Victoria's fears proved partially founded, as she struggled with severe nausea for the first 4 months, and her back ached constantly under the increased weight. But Thomas was endlessly supportive, rubbing her back, holding her hair when she was sick, taking over more of the physical labor around their ranch. The town's reaction to Victoria's pregnancy was predictable. Some people expressed polite congratulations, while others made snide comments about how Victoria was already big and would probably be enormous by the time the baby came. Victoria tried to ignore them, focusing instead on preparing for the baby's arrival. She and Thomas converted the small storage room off their bedroom into a nursery, with Thomas building a beautiful cradle from pine wood and Victoria sewing blankets and tiny clothes. In late November of 1885, as the first snow began to fall across the Nebraska prairie, Victoria went into labor. It was long and difficult, lasting nearly 18 hours, and there were moments when Victoria was certain she was going to die. But Thomas never left her side, holding her hand, encouraging her, refusing to let her give up. Finally, just as dawn broke on a cold winter morning, their son was born. He came into the world squalling and red-faced and absolutely perfect. The doctor, a kind man named Dr. Harrison who had treated Victoria with nothing but respect, placed the baby in Victoria's arms and said, "Congratulations, Mrs. Parker. You have a healthy boy." Victoria looked down at her son, at his tiny fingers and his dark hair and his blue eyes that were so like his father's, and felt a love so powerful it took her breath away. "Hello, sweet boy," she whispered. "Welcome to the world." Thomas was crying openly, unashamed of his tears as he gazed at his wife and newborn son. "He is perfect," he said hoarsely. "Victoria, you did it. You are amazing." They named him Timothy Harrison Parker, Timothy for Thomas's father who had died when Thomas was young, and Harrison in honor of the doctor who had brought him safely into the world. Little Timothy was a healthy, happy baby who rarely cried and seemed to love being held. Thomas was a devoted father from the very beginning, getting up in the night to bring Timothy to Victoria for feeding, changing diapers without complaint, and spending hours simply holding his son and marveling at him. The experience of becoming a mother transformed something in Victoria. She had spent so much of her life feeling less than, feeling unworthy, but watching Thomas with their son, seeing the family they had created together, made her realize just how wrong all her doubts had been. She was not unworthy. She was not less than. She was a woman who had overcome incredible adversity to build a beautiful life, and she was teaching her son, through her own example, that a person's worth has nothing to do with their appearance. As Timothy grew from a baby into a toddler, the Parker Ranch continued to thrive. They now had a substantial herd of cattle, and Victoria's vegetable business had become so successful that she had to hire 4 helpers instead of 2. They had paid off their debt to Jim Patterson ahead of schedule and were even able to purchase an additional 20 acres of land. More importantly, they had finally earned the respect of most of the town. It was impossible to deny that Thomas and Victoria Parker had one of the strongest marriages in Scottsbluff, that they had built their success through honest work and genuine partnership. Even the women who had been cruelest to Victoria in the past now greeted her politely, though Victoria suspected it had more to do with her success than any real change of heart. When Timothy was 2 years old, Victoria discovered she was pregnant again. This pregnancy was easier than the first, perhaps because she knew what to expect, perhaps because she was less afraid. Their second child, a daughter they named Violet Marie Parker, was born in the spring of 1888. She had her mother's dark hair and her father's blue eyes, and from the moment she was born, she was a force to be reckoned with. Thomas was just as devoted to Violet as he was to Timothy, and watching him with his daughter made Victoria fall in love with him all over again. He was endlessly patient with the children, playing with them for hours, reading them stories, teaching them about the ranch and the animals. He never once suggested that Victoria should be the sole caretaker of the children, instead insisting that parenting was something they should do together. One evening, when Timothy was 4 and Violet was 2, the family was sitting on their porch watching the sunset, just as Victoria and Thomas had done so many evenings before the children were born. Timothy was on Thomas's lap, chattering about the new calf that had been born that morning, while Violet was snuggled against Victoria's side, her thumb in her mouth and her eyes drooping with sleep. "Can you believe this is our life?" Victoria asked Thomas softly. "Sometimes I still cannot quite believe it is real." Thomas reached over and took her hand, squeezing it gently. "It is real, sweetheart. You deserve all of this and more. You deserve every bit of happiness." "I could not have any of it without you," Victoria said. "You changed my life, Thomas. You saw me when everyone else looked through me. You loved me when I could not love myself. You gave me everything." "You gave me everything too," Thomas replied. "Before I met you, I was just drifting, working one job after another, never really settling. You gave me a home, Victoria. You gave me purpose. You gave me a family. You gave me love. I am the lucky one." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching as the sun sank below the horizon and the first stars began to appear. Timothy had fallen asleep on Thomas's lap, and Violet was breathing deeply against Victoria's side. "You ever think about that day I rode up to your homestead?" Thomas asked eventually. "How differently things might have turned out if I had just ridden past, if I had listened to those men in the saloon and believed their lies about you." "Sometimes," Victoria admitted, "but I prefer to focus on what did happen. You did not ride past. You did not listen to their lies. You saw me for who I really was, and you chose me." "I will always choose you," Thomas said fiercely. "In every lifetime, in every version of this story, I will always choose you." Victoria leaned over and kissed him softly, careful not to wake the children. "And I will always choose you, Cowboy." Always. The years continued to pass, bringing both joys and challenges. The ranch had occasional setbacks, bad weather or sick cattle or market fluctuations, but Thomas and Victoria faced each obstacle together and emerged stronger. They had 2 more children, another boy named Theodore in 1890 and a girl named Vera in 1893, rounding out their family at 4 healthy, happy children. The children grew up knowing they were loved unconditionally, and they inherited the best qualities of both their parents. Timothy had his father's strength and his mother's business sense, and he took to ranching like he was born for it. Violet had her mother's determination and her father's charm, and she was fearless in ways that both delighted and terrified her parents. Theodore was quiet and thoughtful, with a gift for working with animals that amazed everyone. And little Vera was the baby of the family, spoiled by her siblings and parents alike, with a sunny disposition that could brighten the darkest day. Victoria made sure to teach her daughters that their worth was not determined by their appearance, that strength and intelligence and kindness were far more important than conforming to society's narrow standards of beauty. She taught them to stand up for themselves and for others who were being treated unfairly. And she taught them, through her own example, that true love was about partnership and respect, not about one person being in charge while the other submitted. As the children grew older and more independent, Victoria found herself reflecting more and more on the journey that had brought her to this point. She thought about the young woman she had been, so beaten down by years of shame and judgment that she had almost believed she deserved to be alone. She thought about how Thomas had seen through all of that to the strong, capable woman underneath, and how his love had given her the courage to see herself that way too. One day, when Victoria was in town picking up supplies, she encountered one of the women who had been particularly cruel to her in the past. Mrs. Henderson was older now, her hair completely gray and her face lined with wrinkles. She approached Victoria hesitantly, clearly nervous. "Mrs. Parker," she said quietly. "I wonder if I might have a word with you." Victoria steeled herself, expecting some new criticism or judgment, but to her surprise, Mrs. Henderson's eyes were filled with what looked like genuine remorse. "I owe you an apology," Mrs. Henderson said. "A long overdue apology. I was cruel to you for years, and I said terrible things about you and your husband. I was wrong, Mrs. Parker, about everything. You have built a wonderful life, and you have been nothing but kind and gracious, even to people like me who did not deserve it. I am sorry. I know it does not change the past, but I wanted you to know that I am sorry." Victoria was stunned. In all the years she had lived in Scottsbluff, she had never expected to receive an apology from any of the people who had hurt her. "Thank you," she managed to say. "I appreciate you telling me that. You are more gracious than I deserve," Mrs. Henderson said with a sad smile. "I hope you know that many of us in town have realized what a remarkable woman you are. We should have seen it from the beginning." As Victoria drove home that afternoon, she thought about Mrs. Henderson's apology and realized something profound. She no longer needed those apologies. She no longer needed the town's approval or acceptance. She had built a life filled with love and purpose, and the opinions of people who had judged her so harshly no longer had power over her. That evening, as she and Thomas sat on their porch watching their children play in the yard, Victoria told him about the encounter. Thomas listened quietly, then said, "How did it feel hearing her apologize?" "Honestly, it felt good, but not in the way I expected," Victoria replied. "I thought if someone ever apologized to me, I would feel vindicated, like I had finally been proven right. But instead, I just felt sad for all the years I wasted caring what people like her thought about me." "You did not waste those years," Thomas said gently. "You were surviving, doing the best you could with what you had, and look at what you have built in spite of all of it. Look at our children, our ranch, our life. You did not let their cruelty destroy you, Victoria. You rose above it." Victoria leaned her head on Thomas's shoulder, watching as Timothy helped Violet climb a tree while Theodore chased little Vera around the yard, making her shriek with laughter. "We rose above it," she corrected softly. "I could not have done any of this without you." "We make a good team," Thomas agreed, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "The best team." As the years continued to pass and their children grew into adults, Thomas and Victoria's love only deepened. They celebrated their 20th wedding anniversary in 1902, surrounded by their children and grandchildren. Timothy had married a lovely woman named Sarah and had given them 2 grandchildren already. Violet was engaged to a schoolteacher from the next town over, a gentle man who clearly adored her fierce spirit. Theodore was still at home, helping run the ranch, which had grown into one of the most successful operations in the region. And Vera, their baby, was teaching at the local school and making a difference in the lives of children who, like her mother, might not fit society's narrow definitions of acceptable. On their anniversary, Thomas gave Victoria a gift, a beautifully bound journal. "I want you to write down your story," he said. Not for me, but for our grandchildren and their children. I want them to know what an incredible woman you are, what you overcame, what you built. Your story deserves to be told, Victoria." Victoria ran her fingers over the smooth leather cover of the journal, tears pricking her eyes. "Our story," she corrected. "None of this would exist without you, Thomas. You saved me." "No," Thomas said firmly, taking her face in his hands the way he had so many times over the years. "You saved yourself, Victoria. You were always strong, always capable, always worthy. I just helped you see it, but the strength was always yours." Victoria did write her story, spending evenings at the kitchen table filling page after page with her memories. She wrote about the shame and the hurt, but also about the joy and the triumph. She wrote about finding love when she had given up hope, about building a family and a legacy, about learning to see herself through the eyes of someone who truly loved her. She wrote about the cowboy who had ridden up to her homestead on a hot July morning, who had looked at her with respect instead of disgust, who had defended her honor and fought for her, and ultimately shown her what it meant to be truly loved. She wrote about how he had proposed not despite her strength, but because of it, how he had wanted a strong woman exactly like her, and she wrote about the life they had built together, a life that had exceeded her wildest dreams. A life filled with love and laughter, hard work and triumph, challenges overcome and dreams achieved. A life that proved that society's judgments were worthless in the face of genuine love and partnership. As Victoria wrote the final words of her story one evening, Thomas came to stand behind her chair, reading over her shoulder. When he finished, he wrapped his arms around her and held her close. "That is quite a story," he said softly, "one for the ages." "It is our story," Victoria replied, setting down her pen and turning to look up at her husband. His hair was gray now, and there were deep lines around his eyes, but to Victoria, he was just as handsome as the day they met. "And I would not change a single word of it." "Neither would I," Thomas said, and kissed his wife, his partner, his love, with all the passion and devotion he had shown her for more than 2 decades. They lived many more happy years together, watching their children build their own successful lives and their grandchildren grow into fine young people. They celebrated their 30th anniversary, then their 40th, each year bringing new joys and new memories. When Thomas died peacefully in his sleep at the age of 73, Victoria was devastated but also grateful. Grateful that she had known such love, that she had spent nearly 50 years married to a man who had cherished her every single day. She lived another 5 years after his death, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, sharing stories about their grandfather and the incredible love story that had begun with a cowboy who looked past society's judgments and saw the true worth of a strong woman. Victoria's journal was passed down through the generations of the Parker family, and her story inspired countless others who struggled with shame and judgment. It became a testament to the transformative power of genuine love, and proof that society's definitions of worth and beauty are meaningless compared to the qualities of character that truly matter. In the end, Victoria Lawson Parker's legacy was not about overcoming her size or proving the town wrong. It was about the beautiful life she built through strength, determination, love, and partnership. It was about the family she raised to be kind and compassionate, to see past surfaces to the heart underneath. And it was about the love story that began when a cowboy on a hot July morning in 1882 looked at a woman the world had dismissed and said, "I want a strong woman like you." That love story, that beautiful, heartfelt, world-defying love story, lived on long after both Thomas and Victoria were gone, inspiring generations to love boldly, judge kindly, and see the worth in every person regardless of what society says they should be. And in the quiet moments, when the prairie wind blew across the land that Thomas and Victoria had worked together, their descendants could almost hear their voices, still whispering words of love across the years, still proving that true love sees not with the eyes but with the heart.